Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Winter Playoffs Semifinals overview and analysis video. This is technically going to be all of the lower bracket best of fives leading into grand finals, so it's going to be obviously the third, fourth place matchup to qualify for semifinals, and then the semifinals themselves. We're going to be covering both of those series in today's video, but it's easier to just title this the semifinals because that's what you're here for. By the end of this video, we walk in with 3 teams alive on the lower part of this bracket. We walk out with only 1 left, trying to challenge G2 in the grand finals to see who's going to become the LEC Winter Split Champion and who will represent the region at the First Stand International Tournament. A lot on the line, obviously, for all 3 of the teams involved today. If you're excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Let me know what you thought was going to happen in these games. Did they live up to your expectations? Were they as fun and as creative, as interesting as maybe you thought they were going to be? Or were you surprised by the outcomes? Are there any player performances that shocked you in a good or a bad way? Always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on the entirety of the LEC split up until this point, check out the playlist up on the iCard. We've covered every single game so far of the LEC in 2025, and that's going to carry through. We're going to finish, obviously, these 2 series, and then we'll be covering the finals after it happens later this weekend. This video is coming out as quickly as I could because if you guys didn't know, I was live all day today covering the NACL OQs. I'm the official co-streamer for Citadel Gaming. I went over it in my LPL video, but if you're interested, I'm going to be live basically every single day over the next 3 weekends covering the NACL OQs, covering Citadel Gaming, just generally covering the tournament, and, you know, I'll be there to talk and chat and, you know, talk about basically anything League of Legends related if you are interested, so definitely check that out if you are. But like I said, today is going to be covering the LEC. I don't want to bore you guys with promo too much at the beginning. Let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of these series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of both series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, be looking at the finals. We will be previewing the finals at the end of today's video, but most of it will be spent talking about the 2 series that lead up into it. So without further ado, let's get into the first one. This is not going to be the semifinals. This is going to be, I guess, the series leading into the semifinals. As far as I'm aware, it's the only round 3 series of the entire tournament, technically on the bracket. So let's talk about it. It's a very intriguing one. Both of these teams coming down from upper bracket in round 2, having to win 1 more series to qualify for the best of 5 stage. But the teams that couldn't quite get through that upper bracket to get to that BO5 stage, it's a matchup between the number 1 seeded Fnatic and the number 4 seeded Movistar KOI. Very different teams coming into this, and I think they're coming in with very different sets of momentum. I think Fnatic has looked so much better over the course of 2025. Like, if you look at the grand scheme of things, Fnatic was just way better for the most part across this entire split. Their macro was better, their gameplay was better, their mechanics were better. It just all was really clicking for them. They go into the playoffs as the number 1 seed, the clear number 1 team in the LEC, and they can't get past G2 yet again. It's a roadblock in their way, and actually G2 kind of exposed some of the flaws in Fnatic's system. I hate to say it, but there is an inherent inconsistency to having a couple of these players on your roster. Razork and Humanoid have just never been perfect throughout the entirety of a year. You are just going to have to live with moments where they are not particularly good for your team, and that's just a sad fact of, you know, what being a Fnatic fan is like. Mickey X, as good of a player as he has been, he truly has been incredibly valuable towards Fnatic throughout the entirety of this year. He's not a perfect player. He's gonna have bad games every once in a while. I think Upset and Oscar Rinnan are the 2 most consistent players on the team right now, but both of them have had their inconsistencies in the past, and so you're looking at Fnatic as a team that definitely still has a lot to prove, and they're coming off of a series that they should have absolutely dominated against Team BDS, and quite frankly, they shouldn't even be here in terms of how they played in that series. They walked out of that series basically losing it 3-0 and somehow winning it 2-1 because BDS just couldn't hang on to a lead in the back half. There is a ton for this team to end up coming out improving, and they're going to have to do it now. It is do or die in the playoffs, and KOI is certainly not a walkover opponent. Now, KOI themselves have their own set of inconsistencies, I think, very similar to Fnatic. A lot of those come through the middle of the map. It's Elyoya and Jojo Pume that have just not necessarily felt like they've been on the same page throughout the entirety of 2025 so far. Both of them have had moments where they just feel off, and I'm not entirely sure if it's just a playstyle problem. Obviously, both of them are very resource heavy. Both of them have shown in the past that they would prefer to be kind of main characters members of their individual teams. It's why someone like Elyoya has worked at his absolute best with someone like Niski in the mid lane, and it's why Jojo Pune has always struggled with high tempo, high resource early game junglers, because it's just not really a style that fits Jojo. It's not really a style that fits Elyoya, and I think that that's kind of come into conflict here for KOI, but everybody else on this team I think has been exceptional. Supa and Alvaro have been one of the best bot lanes in the entirety of Europe. Mirwin has really taken that leap in 2025. He's been super consistent so far this year. I was a bit worried that Fearless was going to be able to expose him. The only way we're going to know if that's going to be the case is obviously to go throughout this series, but in terms of like relevant meta picks, he's got Cassante and Mbessa, and then a lot of the off-meta stuff. Obviously, you hope that his champion pool is a bit deeper than what it has seemed like recently, but I think Fearless could be a bit scarier for a player like Mirwin than it is for a lot of the other top laners. Like someone like Oscar Inen on the other side, I think adapts a little bit better on paper to something like Fearless. So when you're looking at this matchup in particular, KOI looked way better in round number 2. Fnatic had their problems against BDS. They still got over the hump, but Fnatic looked so much better before that it's really how much do you value recent tape and how much do you value the regular season tape? How much do you value what we've seen for the most part across this entire split? I think lane by lane, Oscar and Mirwin are both playing great right now. I would slightly favor Oscar just because I think he is a little bit better suited to be playing these long best of 5s, but I certainly do think that either could come out on top. Again, Mirwin is looking really good. Supa and Alvaro versus Upset and Mickey X, these might be the two best performing bot lanes, maybe outside of K-Corp in the entire league, even including G2. Like, they've really been that good across this entire year. Upset and Mickey have been probably number 1 in terms of performances, but we know they can be a bit flippy. I think Supa and Alvaro have a higher floor. They're probably a bit more consistent, but I think Upset and Mickey on their best day is better than Supa and Alvaro, and so I'm just going to be interested to see where that bot lane matchup ends up going. But really, at the end of the day, Jojo Pune versus Humanoid, that's what we're here for. We are here to talk about two of the more volatile, high mechanic mid laners in the entire league going toe-to-toe and seeing which one comes out on top. Elyoya and Razork is obviously a very classic Spanish jungle matchup that we've seen plenty of times, but if this mid lane matchup really leans one way or another throughout this series, I think that that is likely going to just be what ends up, causing the series to I guess really swing in the direction of one team or another. Again, I want to say at the beginning, I don't want to preface it too much, but I do apologize if my voice is a little bit gone. I have been streaming for 5 hours all day, and so it definitely is a little bit more to go into this and film another, 2 to 3 hours of audio and then cut that down to make sure it's something that's listenable. But I do hope you guys stick with me. If my voice sounds a little bit different, I do apologize. A little bit gravelier, I do apologize. I can't do much about it, but without further ado, let's get into the series. Again, the only way to know how things go between KOI and Fnatic is, of course, to go game by game. So let's start with game number 1. Let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and they looked very good here in game number 1. Now, KOI definitely gave them a run for their money. This was not some sort of blowout by any means. I think that there were actually a ton of really creative, really strong plays made by KOI, and it was the members you would expect to be very active on the map. I think the engages in general in the front line from KOI was very, very strong and very active in this game. I think we'll talk about Mirwin. He was definitely the star for KOI on their side, but Fnatic just had a little bit more firepower. They had their own top laner that was really stepping up, but the big difference maker was that their bot lane was absolutely elite in this game, and I think they played really, really excellent. Let's talk about the draft really quick. I'm going to go a bit against the grain here, and I'm going to say that Fnatic actually had the weaker of these two drafts. I think you have more options as KOI. Not only do you scale better because Kai'Sa Yone is just so difficult to deal with, Maokai obviously adds on to that later on in the game, but I actually think you're in a pretty decent position lane matchup-wise. You're looking at quite a few lanes that just have more prio than others. I'm really anti-Corki mid. I've talked about it a lot on this channel. I think Corki is a very good champion that can do a lot in a lot of different circumstances in the bot lane. Like, I think he is very valuable in that role. I think the moment you put him mid lane, then his lack of ability to skirmish over a lot of these objectives is just very exploitable, and I think specifically something like Yone can do a really good job of actually going out and exploiting that, but it just wasn't meant to be here. Jojo Pune did not have a particularly good game. It's something we're going to talk about. I think on top of that, like, Rumble on paper just should not be performing nearly as well as he actually is in reality. I continue to believe that Rumble should be getting outplayed, that, things like Cassante should generally be bad matchups for him, but they're just not. Cassante has not really really been able to keep Rumble down. Jace has not been able to keep Rumble down. We've just seen this champion continue to perform well in all of these best of fives in every region across the world. So at some point, I've just got to throw out that analysis. I think the main one for me is just that Vi should not play particularly well into Maokai. This is like a notoriously good matchup for Maokai. This is Vi's worst matchup of all of the meta junglers, and picking Vi on B1 very much opens the door for something like Maokai to come out of the other side. It just didn't really feel like they were going to have the tempo, Fnatic that is, they were going to have the tempo and the pressure to be able to do a lot of the things that they needed to do in the early game to get to the late game, but here we are. They end up getting to 37 minutes. They end up being able to win the pivotal team fight that ends up mattering at the end, and all of a sudden the game is over, and that's regardless of the fact that Mirwin played really well in this one. So let's get into it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Upset in the bot lane. Great stuff from him. I actually thought he played really well on the Ezreal. He's been unreal throughout this entire split. He's actually just been the best AD carry in Europe, and it's not been particularly close. Like, I love Supa, I love Kaliste. I think both of them are playing great. Hansam is a very good player. Like, you can throw out a lot of different names. Noah has been awesome over the course of this year, but Upset is just kind of on his own level at this point. It feels like 2020 all over again, when we were really singing this guy's praises when he was going to finals and, you know, performing really well. It feels like he's gotten that form back here on Fnatic, and golly, am I so excited to be able to say that. Like, his ability to team fight in the back half here on Ezreal was so integral towards the success of Fnatic, and I honestly just do not believe that they would have won this game without Upset there. I think you could give it to other members. Mickey X was excellent here on the Rel. We talked about if one of these bot lanes was just going to be better than the other, specifically if Upset and Mickey were going to play world class, like if they were going to be the best bot lane in Europe and have that kind of performance, that's going to be a problem for KOI to be able to answer. They're not going to have a very clean answer to that, and that's exactly what happened here in game number one. Upset and Mickey were both fantastic. Mickey with the engages and Upset with the follow-through. And then Oscar Ridden continues to just look great on things like Rumble, basically anything. He can win in lane, he can win in team fights. He's just playing the best league he's ever played in his entire career right now. And that's the kind of progression you just got to be really excited about, that you do have to hype up. I've had a lot of people in my comment sections over the past couple of years talk about how I'm undervaluing and underestimating Oscar Ridden. Well, here you go. The guy's playing out of his mind right now, and I'm really happy for him. Razork and Huma were good. Would still like to see Huma not pick Corki. I guess that's not on the table for the rest of the series, but still, I think that champion could have been more effective in the back half of this game, and it just wasn't. Humanoid didn't have like a stellar game. I just don't think he had a bad one. Razork was all right, but also was a little bit too aggro. This is a tough Vi game just in general, again, mostly because of the Maokai, but for a lot of different reasons. There are a lot of ways to shut down Vi in terms of this KOI comp, so I'm not going to freak out over Razork. I think Fnatic did more than enough to be able to, you know, come out on top here in game number one, even if it was super close in the end, and KOI put up a really good fight, and that's where I don't want to disparage KOI. I think they actually did come out and try to win in a, a pretty effective manner. I think their draft was really solid, especially considering it was a red side draft. I think they did a really good job of gathering a lot of pieces that formed a very cohesive unit, and I think they should have won this game. They just didn't have the talent to be able to overcome the best players on Fnatic. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Jojo Pune in the mid lane. I don't think he had a miserable game. I just don't think he had a great game here on the Yone. I think that there were definitely some optimizations that I would have preferred to see out of him in terms of some of these fights, and I think, again, the lack of damage he was outputting at the end of this game was way too consequential towards why KOI ended up losing. I certainly don't want to put the blame on anybody else. Supa certainly could have been more active. Alvaro, I think, had a couple of bad engages on the Alistar, but I'm not blaming them. If the problem is that Supa could have done more on the Kai'Sa, then I certainly think that we can look in other directions. Elyoya was really good on the Maokai, had a great game. Again, maybe he could have been more active, maybe he could have pressured the tempo a bit more, but it's Maokai. You don't necessarily feel like you want to do that in that champion, and Mirwin was awesome on the Cassante. This guy's actually become a Cassante menace. Cassante and Mbessa have both been great picks for him over the course of this year, alongside a lot of the other crazy, off-meta picks that you expect to see out of him in a series. One of the big reasons that Mirwin has leveled up is because he has gotten really good at two actually meta champions, which is something he wasn't very good at last year. So credit to KOI. I think they put up a good fight, but it just wasn't enough, and now they're down 0-1. Like, it's all well and good to have been very close in game number one, but if you don't come out in game number two and actually put up a really good fight, if you don't come out in game number two and show, oh yeah, like, we can actually keep this series alive. Like, 0-2 as a deficit, winning 3 games in a row against Fnatic, that is a nightmare situation. You don't want to be in that, and Fnatic would love to be up 2-0 in that series. So is that what's going to happen, or is KOI going to be able to bounce back and tie everything up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they've taken full control. They are dominating the beginning part of this series. We obviously gave KOI a lot of credit for game number 1 because they did do a good job of surviving, and I think this was another example of, like, they played fine, like they did everything that they were supposed to do. They just drafted a comp that was so not playable in this particular circumstance. They invested so heavily into one style of play without ever really considering doing anything else with their draft that it ended up really costing them. And Fnatic, to their credit, just drafted the most proactive comp in the entire game. When you look at these two drafts, they are polar opposites. Xin Zhao, Taliyah, Varus have so much prio, so much pressure early on. They're going to be able to skirmish over everything. You basically have three winning lanes. Not basically, you do have three winning lanes. Basically, any way you slice it, Gwen is better than Ornn in the early game. She shreds tanks. Taliyah is going to be able to out-roam and out-pressure the Azir. And Varus Nautilus is just going to be stronger than Jinx Leona before they get online. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And then you add a Xin Zhao into the mix going up into a Sejuani, and there's genuinely just nothing that KOI is going to be able to do to match the pressure early. They just have to hope and pray that Fnatic don't do too much to be able to get this game out of control, but yet Fnatic did do a lot. They actually were very active on the map, and they ended up decimating this game because of it. Again, I don't even know how in-depth I should go on this, because I actually just don't know how playable this draft is if Fnatic is like even halfway decent at the game, which obviously they are. They were the #1 seed in the LEC, so we can talk about who ended up actually making the most of it, which was, of course, once again Upset in the bot lane. The dude is just on fire. When you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. He's playing so aggro right now. He's stepping up, attempting to absolutely punish anybody who's in a bad position at any point throughout the game. Ask Alvaro, ask Elyoya, ask Supa what, Upset is playing like right now. They're going to be like, yeah, if I step into his vicinity, he is going to do everything in his power to kill me on the spot. It's genuinely ridiculous how aggressive he has been and how much it has worked for him. I don't know why he hasn't been doing this the past couple of years. I get that team situation is different, and I get that generally you probably have to have teammates that you trust and that you can count on in order to feel comfortable enough to go ahead and play this style. But man, if he was doing this, I would have felt a lot better about why he was losing in a lot of his previous stops. This is the Upset we have been waiting to see for so many years. Basically ever since he left Fnatic the last time in 2022. This is the Upset we've kind of been waiting for, and you know what? He is definitely back. He has looked incredibly good this year. Again, the best player on Fnatic at the current moment. Razork was the best player in the regular season, but I think it's become clear that Upset is the most valuable player to this team when it really comes down to crunch time, when it comes down to big moments. And it wasn't just him. I thought both Humanoid and Razork did play well in this game. Humanoid once again on the Taliyah. This is kind of the opposite. What is it with blue side early picking champions that just have no priority in lane? In game number 1, Humanoid early picked the Corki. In game number 2, Jojo Pune early picks the Azir. These are very counterable, very dealable with mid laners, and I just don't really understand why we're prioritizing them so heavily in the current meta. Azir has been taken advantage of so consistently in every single region when he's blind picked early on in these fearless drafts, specifically by a champion like Taliyah that can just be everywhere on the map. Like, Azir just has no way to be able to match that kind of pressure, and Humanoid was really good in this game. I think you could have asked for maybe a bit more in terms of the damage output, but again, like, he was supposed to be the facilitator, and that's exactly what he was, the shove and roam mid. That's Taliyah, and that's what he executed. Razork was excellent in this game. I think he's going to go a bit undervalued for his performance in this one because Upset and Mickey were very flashy, and I think Humanoid on the Taliyah had a really nice counter pick, but Razork was awesome here. Oscar had a really nice game. Mickey was solid on the Nautilus, even if he was caught out a bit more than maybe he should have been, as, typically Mickey X is, but overall, just a really good game from Fnatic. They were gifted the keys to the kingdom in the early game. They had full control of this, and they walked away in a really, really great spot because of it. And for KOI on the other side, I just don't really get this draft, man. Like, I can understand Azir Jinx in, like, isolation if you have a jungler that can facilitate something in the early game, a top laner that you can play for. I can understand, like, Sejuani plus Ornn on the top side if you've got a carry to enable on the bottom side, but, like, all of these pieces together, it just feels so scared and so passive. You're never going to be able to do anything in the early game. Like I said earlier, you're looking at 3 losing lanes, like, without fail. Basically, any configuration of these lanes ends up being losing for you, and you don't really have ways to be able to skirmish in the mid game. You're going to get out-roamed in the middle of the map by the Taliyah. The Sejuani is not going to have enough combat power to actively go toe-to-toe with the Xin Zhao really at any point, and Gwen shreds tanks. Like, Ornn, Sej, Leona, like, they all kind of get broken open here by the R5 Gwen on the top side. I just don't really understand the idea behind KOI's draft. I think it is very exploitable, and it really came back to bite them. And, like I said earlier, I don't even know if it's entirely the player's fault. I think that there were some good performances. Supa was okay in this game on the Jinx. I think he definitely attempted to get himself fed, even if it wasn't necessarily super successful. I think Mirwin and Elyoya weren't exactly disastrous on the tanks on the top side. They just weren't exactly like the solution to the problem either. I think dud of the game to me was pretty obvious. It's going to go to Alvaro in the support position on the Leona. Right now, it just feels like Alvaro is getting out-pressured by Mickey X, even though Alvaro was involved in more kills in this game. 07-12 versus 07-11. That doesn't necessarily tell the story of what happened between these two players in this game. I can guarantee you that Alvaro was in a lot more bad positions than Mickey X was. And you could say the same thing about Supa. You could say the same thing about Jojo Pune on the Azir, who, again, I'm very critical of because why is he picking Azir? Why are you B1 Azir in a series where you need to be a big playmaker for your team in the middle of the map? It just feels like such a reckless decision, and it really did come back to bite him. So a lot of things to be frustrated about, quite frankly, for KOI in this game number 2, and now they're down 0-2 in this series. They can't even afford to lose a single more game. They have to win 3 in a row against Fnatic. Obviously, that is a big challenge in and of itself, but you got to start here in game number 3. If you can't win game 3, you're getting swept out of the playoffs here. Not exactly the circumstance that I think this team was looking for coming off of a Worlds appearance and adding one of the most hyped North American players of all time. But Fnatic would love to sweep their way into the semifinals. That's the exact kind of confidence booster that they were looking for coming off of that BDS series. So are they going to be able to close this out in a 3-0 clean sweep? Or is KOI going to be able to take game 3 and keep this series alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Movistar KOI. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series at the very least for one more game, and they did it in pretty dominant fashion. This was the most dominant game of the entire day. Up until this point, we really had not seen Fnatic dominate like this. Both of Fnatic's wins, while they were, pretty good, like game 2 especially, they definitely controlled the entire game. They at least had moments where KOI looked like they could survive in some situations. I had things I could talk about where it was like, Supa looked alright in game 2, or generally speaking, like Mirwin looked great in game number 1. Like, there were takeaways. There just are no takeaways for Fnatic in game number 3. This was a decimation of this team, and quite frankly, I'm shocked. Like, I really am stunned, not only because it felt like Fnatic kind of had KOI's number going into this series, and just generally with how things had happened in the first 2 games, but because after this draft, I thought it was over for KOI. I did not think they were going to have the tempo and the ability to capitalize on the draft that they ended up drafting. Fnatic has a ton of late game outs, but Lee Sin also just generally out jungles Jarvan in the early game. This is something we've talked about plenty on this channel over the past like 3 or 4 years. Lee Sin has a very good matchup into Jarvan, and so when I saw this draft, I'm like, well, Lee Sin kind of runs the early game, and I think Fnatic scales better. I don't really see an avenue for KOI to be able to win this. The avenue was just Fnatic playing really bad and KOI playing really good. And honestly, it really is as simple as that. This was just one of those games where KOI came out with a purpose to prove. They did not want to get swept out of the playoffs, and Fnatic just didn't really show up, despite the fact that they had a comp that I think could do a lot throughout this game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game could go to basically anybody on KOI. I think it's entirely fair to just say, throw it up in the air, give it to whoever you want. I'm going to give it to Supa on the Kalista. I thought he was the most relevant damage carry. If you wanted to give it to Alvaro on the Braum, I think that makes a lot of sense. More specifically, if you want to give it to Elyoya on the Jarvan, I also think that makes a ton of sense. I thought he had a really good Jarvan game. This is a champion that's really fallen out of favor with a lot of League players, a lot of League pros. Just in general, we're really not seeing Jarvan anywhere in the world right now, and that's for a lot of different reasons. I think they are right, for the most part, to not play Jarvan, and in fact, I don't even think this is a particularly good Jarvan game. Even if you do like the champion, I think that this is, like I said, one of those games where it feels like he really shouldn't have a lot of pressure early, and that's probably going to doom the rest of his team, but here we are, Elyoya going deathless, setting up everything for the entire game, and looking really good doing it. Jojo Pune definitely had his best game of the series up until this point on the Ahri. Put him on something mobile, put him on something that can move around, don't put him on Azir, don't put him on even Yone, right? Like, put him on Ahri, put him on, I know Talia's gone, but like, put him on roamers, put him on something that can be proactive. That's what we want to see out of Jojo Pune. That's always what he has been at his absolute best at. Mirwin goes deathless on the Sion. Again, we're seeing so many non-passive Sion games, which is unbelievable. Too many across the world of people just not utilizing the Sion passive. Such a shame, but overall, just a fantastic game from KOI, only giving over 1 death the entire game, and it goes to my player of the game, but still a fantastic performance, and honestly one that I was very surprised by, and that can go for Fnatic as well. I was shocked to see Fnatic just kind of not show up here in game number 3. I guess they felt they had such a strong lead in this series, if they could afford to take one more game off to get an extra game of experience or something like that on stage, maybe that was the explanation, because they got slaughtered here. Like, this was not even a remotely interesting game at any point. This completely devolved super quickly. Razork lost pressure of the map basically instantly on a champion that should have it for free in this matchup and just didn't. Oscar Rinnan was getting abused on the top side on this Cho'Gath. Broken Blade, he was not, in terms of the performance he was giving here. Humanoid obviously didn't play particularly well on the Aurora. We already talked about how Jojo Pune did a great job of establishing pressure on the Ahri. Well, Humanoid wasn't able to match that, really, under any circumstance. Mickey X looked awful on the Renata. Upset didn't really do anything majorly wrong on the Draven. The entire game plan, of course, in this draft is to get Draven ahead so that he can carry in the late game. Like, he is your late game insurance policy, and I do think you have a lot of options with him, plus the Cho'Gath, plus the Aurora. Like, Renata engages in the back half of this game. There are a ton of different ways, I think, to win this game if the Draven is strong. They just couldn't get him into that position, and quite frankly, it was everybody's fault. This was just like a team gap. There really is no other way to look at it, in my opinion, and I honestly don't even think it requires that much more analysis. I think the draft is in their favor, and I think the momentum was in their favor. They just didn't come out here and try to win. They got completely outplayed early and just kind of gave up in the middle of the game. If they do that one more time here in game number 4, I'm going to start getting concerned, but if they come out and dominate and win game number 4, it's going to be just kind of a blip on the radar. We're going to talk about it as if it was just some random game number 3, but if KOI can come out and win that game 4, if they can keep this series alive and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, then all of a sudden things get significantly more interesting, and I think Fnatic will regret not taking advantage of this matchup more than they did. So what's going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to take this series 3-1. They will be moving on to the semifinals. We'll, of course, talk about that series in just a moment, but that means that Movistar KOI will officially be eliminated here from the LEC in 4th place in the winter split. Not the worst outcome in the world. I think top 4 was a necessity for this team if they finished anything worse than top 4. If any of the actual top 4 teams in the league that are very clearly the top 4 teams of the league, like, finished worse than that, I think that would have been a pretty massive problem. But no, KOI does at least get to top 4. They don't get further than that, and you would have liked to see them play better in this series overall, but it wasn't meant to be. This draft in game number 4 both is good and bad. I think that there are good pieces and good ideas in this draft. I'm not exactly sure if it's the right champions in order to get that point across, but I certainly do understand the idea of saying, like, well, if we can get anything going in the early game and we have this, like, super big late game insurance policy, then we're probably going to be in a decent spot there. The problem is, it's just the wrong champions. There are a couple of picks here that I am just really not a fan of. It's not the Ryze, by the way, although I think you could make a point that the Ryze was not a good pick, if only because Jojo Pune was the one that was going to have to pilot it. Jojo has always made some very funny plays on Ryze. I remember one of my most liked tweets of all time is just a screenshot of Jojo like ulting in place on Ryze as his team gets aced in the bot lane in the LCS on Evil Geniuses. It was a very funny play just in general, and obviously that's something that sticks out to me, but it's the Sivir and the Amumu that I just don't really understand. The Sivir in particular on R1 with Zeri up. You're going to pick a hyper carry with Lulu and you go for Sivir? That's crazy. But for Fnatic, I think you did take advantage of some of the draft mistakes that KOI made. I think you honestly just outplayed KOI throughout the entirety of this series, and you were the better team. Like, there really wasn't a lot to talk about. Fnatic was better, so let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game for me here in game number 4 is going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. This is maybe the best game the Humanoid has played so far in winter, at least in terms of, like, carry, takeover potential. This is the Humanoid that we've kind of been waiting for. Not to say that he's been horrible. I'm not going to try and sit here and tell you that he's been the worst player of all time or that he's been unplayable at all for Fnatic. He's been fine, but he's not been Humanoid, right? Like, he has these spurts where he's just not perfect individually as a player, and leave it to a Syndra game to be able to get him back on track. I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not, but I think Syndra is his best champion. Going back to not only last year in the season finals tournament where he did really well on Syndra as she was coming into meta and, you know, going into the world championships, but going back specifically to 2023 and that version of the season finals, it always just feels like Humanoid is in better form when Syndra is a champion that is playable in the meta. It's just something he feels very comfortable on, and you know what? Syndra's in an okay enough spot for you right now to pick her up in a Fearless draft in game number 4 when a lot of the other higher priority mids that are just going to be able to out-tempo her are gone from the drafting pool, and I think Humanoid did a great job job of capitalizing on that. Quite frankly, he was just better than JoJo Pune, and with all of the trash that JoJo Pune talked before this series, that is certainly not an ideal sentence to say out loud, but player of the series as a whole is absolutely going to go to Upset in the bot lane. He still is the best player for Fnatic, regardless of what Humanoid did in this game, hell, what Mickey X did in this game on the Karma, because I thought he played really well on the Karma. Upset was the most important player for Fnatic across this series. I don't even think it was really all that up for debate for me. I think you could theoretically consider giving this to Oscar Rinnan on the top side, because I do think he was that good, that consistent at the very least throughout this entire thing. Mirwin was really solid as a lane opponent, probably the best player on KOI in this series. It just didn't really end up mattering. Upset was awesome though. If you're going to go for a hyper carry, Zeri is the one to go for in this meta. The reason I was so confused by KOI's decision to pick Sivir on R1 instead of the Zeri, that would have made significantly more sense to me, is because Zeri's really good into Sivir. Like, notoriously, Zeri does really well into Sivir, and so I just don't really understand why you would be like, I'm going to take the Sivir part of that matchup and leave the Zeri open, which beats me, and Zeri's a better champion, and she's enabled more by Lulu. Like, I just don't really get the idea behind Sivir in this draft really at all. I guess it's because she doesn't need protection like nearly as much as something like Zeri does. Like, you kind of have to baby Zeri to get her to the point where she can start taking over games, but that's only the case in lane matchups where she loses. This is not a lane matchup where Zeri loses. She's in a really good spot in this game to be able to take over. So credit to Upset, credit to Mickey. Overall, just good stuff. Oscar, like I said, was terrific in this series. Razork was fine, wasn't the star. I actually think he was probably the player I talked about the least, or thought about the least, in terms of this series in general, but Fnatic looked good. They were definitely the better team here today. I think you could look at all 5 roles and see a player that was better in their individual style than the enemy on the other side, and that's exactly what you want to see out of Fnatic. And for KOI, you know, there were some bright spots, like Mirwin I thought had a really good series, and I think there is still a lot of positives to take away from Mirwin. Supa and Alvaro did not play well down the stretch here. Upset and Mickey were definitely the better bot lane out of these two, and that's frustrating. And Elyoya, I don't think played well. I think he's continuing to try to play these facilitators, and it's really just not working. It's not a style that he feels particularly comfortable on. Like, that is very clear on tape. I just don't think he's the kind of player that wants to play for his mid laner or for a lot of his other laners. He wants to play to win himself, and I think that's always been the case for Elyoya. The more that he's had to play for other players, I think the worse he has individually done, but dud of the game is absolutely JoJo Pune in the mid lane. And again, I don't even think it's the Rise individually. I don't think it's the champion. We've seen that champion really work for a lot of other teams globally, specifically for Showmaker and for Doenby. Like, those two in particular have looked awesome on the Rise, and obviously they're two of the best Rise players ever, and so you can kind of expect them to do so. Like, Rise has shown that in the right situation, he can actually be very valuable and very dominant to whichever team ends up taking him, but JoJo Pune's just not a good Rise player, or at least he hasn't been in pro. There are so many negative moments to look back on with him on this champion. I just don't want to see him on it in a win-or-go-home game number 4. Like, it's just not the circumstance I want to see. I already criticized the Sivir enough. I think it's like actually a wasted pick on R1. I think this is maybe the worst thing you could have taken here. Certainly one of the worst things you could have taken on R1, in my opinion, especially with Zeri still up. Like, it's actually insane. You banned Smolder on second rotation. Just play Smolder in this spot. It's a better situation overall. I just do not get the Sivir, but, you know, Supa didn't play particularly well. That doesn't really help the situation. Again, Alvaro wasn't looking like the better support at all in this series. Mirwin is kind of the one player you're walking out being like, he was awesome, not only in this series, but basically throughout this entire split, and that's a really good sign for Mirwin. If he can continue to stay on track, that's really, really positive for KOI, because he is significantly better than he was last year, and he was the weak link of a team that went to Worlds last year. If he levels up, theoretically, you could be looking at a team that, you know, not only gets top 3, but could compete for top 2. The problem is the rest of this team just doesn't feel like they are gelling right now. Elyoya and JoJo Pune have negative chemistry in the middle of the map, and as much as I like Supa and Alvaro, they threw themselves out the window with this draft in game number 4, so unfortunately for KOI, that's just how the cookie crumbles. That's how their split is going to end. But Fnatic's day, at least in this video, is not done yet. They've got to move on to take on a big piece of competition, we'll just say, in the semifinals in Corp, and I'm excited to cover that series right now. But now it's time to move on to that semifinals series that we were already previewing. This is the final one before the finals, obviously. That's what the semifinals are, but this is the last chance to stay alive in the LEC. If you lose this series, you are eliminated. If you win, you go on to take on G2 in the finals to get the opportunity to represent the LEC at the First Stand International Tournament, and of course, be the LEC Winter Split champion, to actually get, you know, a trophy in the cabinet. Not a lot of teams outside of G2 have been able to do that. Will one of these two be able to compete to do it? It's, of course, a matchup between the number 2 seeded K-Corp and the number 1 seeded Fnatic. Again, we've already talked a lot about Fnatic. We are going to talk about K-Corp in this introduction, but we're also going to mention why this is such an interesting matchup on paper and why I think the storylines going into this series are incredibly interesting and unique, because I really do think that there are quite a few players that have ties to each other across these two teams. Of course, like we said, we already talked about Fnatic. We went through 4 games of Fnatic already. You don't need me to break them down again, but K-Corp is coming in a little bit differently, I would say, than a team like Fnatic or even a team like Movistar KOI did into that previous best of 5, because K-Corp was coming in undefeated outside of losing their best of 5 to G2 in winners finals. They got through the entirety of the winners bracket. They took down Movistar KOI, and they did it pretty handily. It wasn't a particularly difficult series for them to come out on top in. They go up against G2, and they just don't have the firepower to be able to come out on top against what is likely the best team in Europe. But this is still a very talented roster that is peaking at the right time. I've talked about it all year. I really do believe there is a top 3 in the LEC. KOI is in the top 4. I think it is clear that everybody below number 4 is kind of a tier below, but I think KOI is kind of by themselves in that number 4 spot. The top 3 all feel very separated. And K-Corp, for a lot of the split, actually was making some arguments to be at the top of that list. I think some of their tape in the regular season was the best of any team in the LEC. Fnatic had the results, but I think K-Corp's wins were probably the most dominant in the entire league. And that gave me a lot of confidence and a lot of hope that this team could continue to climb throughout the year. And that's exactly what they've done. Again, getting to winners finals was certainly no small feat. And losing to G2 is not the end of the world. The problem is you have to be able to shake that off. And this is kind of a young and inexperienced team, at least at the top level. You have players who have been here who have done that, specifically Kana and Yike on the top of the map here for K-Corp. Kana, obviously a very experienced player in these long-form best of 5s. The guy played for T1, for crying out loud. He knows what it's like to play in a high-pressure environment deep into the playoffs and, you know, late into a playoff run. He knows what it's like to be able to step up in those games as well. But Yike, a multiple-time champion here in the LEC from his time on G2, he also knows what it's like to make these deep runs, and he knows what it's like to overcome adversity, to, you know, see his team kind of struggle a bit at the beginning of playoffs and be able to continue to build up, and then, you know, you inevitably be champions, as G2 has been the past couple of years. Both of them have been very accomplished. Everybody else on this team has a ton to prove. Vladi and Kalist have really not been in these spots before. Vladi obviously got 3rd place with this team in summer of last year, but that run was miraculous. There were a lot of things going right for that team that I don't necessarily think are indicative of what this team is in 2025, at least in my opinion, from my perspective of like the analysis of these teams. And Kalist obviously has never been in the playoffs before. This is his rookie split. This is a big test for him, and this is obviously a do or die series. Targamas also has a pretty big question mark on him, and I think specifically we look at the bot lane because of this matchup, because of the players on the other side of this matchup and their roles and their identities in comparison to K-Corp and what their players are. You have somebody like Kalist who came in to replace Upset on K-Corp this year. They got rid of Upset from last year to bring in this prodigy that had been brewing in their system that they had been waiting to bring up to their main roster for years and years and years just because of the age restriction. And Upset, to his credit, wasn't playing like a superstar on K-Corp, but he goes over to Fnatic and has the best year that he's had in many, many years here in the LEC. This is a very intriguing, very interesting AD carry matchup that I'm very interested to see which direction it goes. And Targamas and Mickey X, people forget, Targamas replaced Mickey X on G2 many years ago when they wanted to go for their first iteration of the youth movement, bringing in Flacket and Targamas as their bot lane. Targamas was the one to come in and replace Mickey, and he wasn't the successor that they were looking for. They had to bring Mickey back onto the team in order to find the success that they were looking for. And so Targamas, I think, is going to have quite a bit to prove in a series like this. Not to mention, Yike definitely wants to get back and get his revenge on his former team in the finals. Kana and Vladi certainly are finals level talent, but it's not like Fnatic is going to come into this series woefully unprepared. Players like Upset and Mickey X have certainly been playing the entirety of this split as if they're expecting to be in the finals, as if they're expecting to be competing to be champions of the LEC. And with players like Humanoid stepping up when it matters the most, and Razork obviously being a really big factor throughout this entire year, Oscar maybe having the best year of his entire career, the best split of his entire career. You have so many factors in favor of Fnatic as well, and they were better in the regular season. They were able to take the regular season matchup between these two, so quite a lot on the line for both of them. But as we always say, only one can come out on top, and the only way to know is to go game by game. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was K-Corp, they are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this was a fantastic game number 1 from K-Corp. You can basically point to anybody on the map and say that they were the most relevant player in this game. Ironically enough, it's really just Khalees that I think had like an easy job in terms of what he was able to do, mostly because the rest of the team was just playing so well, and there were so many enablers on the side of K-Corp, but that's not to say Khalees was bad. He got 10 kills for a reason in this one. I just think everybody else on the roster was absolutely masterful in terms of how they ended up playing out this draft and this situation in general. I don't love K-Corp's draft. I think they fall into a couple of pit holes that I'm not personally that big of a fan of. Most notably, I think I just don't really love the carry duo here for K-Corp. I think Azir on B1 is something that I've really criticized a lot. I get that you banned out the Talia here, and you end up banning out Yone in second rotation, but are we really sitting here and being like, if we take away Talia, then nothing can punish Azir, nothing can roam around the map? I mean, things like Ahri were still very open in this draft, and they went for Smolder instead. I'm going to critique Fnatic very heavily for that, but I'm still not a fan of Azir on B1, even if you are going to supplement that with Ivern in the jungle, which I think does make it a little bit better, if only because Ivern just makes Azir so difficult to deal with. It makes K'Sante so difficult to deal with, but I'm also really not that big of a fan of the Varus on B5. I've never really liked the Varus into Ezreal matchup. I just don't think this is the game to pull the Varus card out. Obviously, Khalees was more than comfortable on the champion, and it really ended up working out, and, you know, I'm kind of picking at straws here. Like, this is really a nitpick at the end of the day, but they're just not the picks that I personally would have taken, and I do think it gave me the idea that Fnatic could walk out of game number 1 in a pretty decent spot through the Ezreal, who I thought was in a really good position to be able to carry this game, and Smolder, I think, had the opportunity to be able to get online. It just didn't really end up happening like that. Fnatic ended up getting really outplayed in the mid game, having no real response, and then the game just spiraled out of control because K-Corp was better, basically across the board. Player of the game, man, take your pick. Like, there are so many options here. I'm going to give it to Targamas in the support position, but Kana was super influential on the K'Sante, and especially pairing up with Yikes Ivern. There just was no way to be able to kill any of these tanks or any of these frontliners throughout this entire game because Yike was making it such a problem, and Targamas was definitely a part of that. I think his ability to move around the map, and quite frankly, his ability to be so much better than Mickey X on the other side of this matchup in this game is a huge reason why K-Corp is walking out as the winner. You just don't see Targamas losing as much as he has in the past couple of years. People don't remember, like, obviously he was bad on K-Corp last year, but people forget how bad he was on Excel in 2023 as well, because the stint was so short. He barely got any time in the winter split because he really was that bad for that roster. It had been years since Targamas had felt like an even average LEC support, and yet he comes in here, and now he's gapping Mickey X, and now he's showing up, and he's, you know, dominating a lot of the playoff series that it took for them to get here in the first place, beating up on KOI. Like, it was insane to see the development of Targamas, and that has carried over here to the semifinals at the very least, to game number 1, where he did just gap Mickey X. Like, there is no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no ambiguity about it. Targamas was just straight up better here in game number 1, but like I said, you want to give this to Kana because the K'Sante was actually undealable with throughout this entire game, then that's entirely fair. I think Kana was brilliant in this one. I think the Ivern Shields makes that champion completely unkillable, and he does a ton of damage. There's no way to actually take down the K'Sante. Really great stuff from him. Yike was super influential on the entire game because of that Ivern pick. Still a champion that I believe is very underplayed. Razork is a notorious Ivern player. I think it was a really good idea for K-Corp to be able to pick that in game number 1, pick up their win, and take that out of the pool and Fearless for the rest of the series, not allow Fnatic to get their hands on that really at any point. Vladi looked excellent on the Azir. That's the only thing I can give him, like, an aside for, is because I just don't like Azir on B1, but if you are going to pilot it well, at the very least, you can get away with it in that front. I still think that there are other options. There are other ways to draft Azir that don't require you to spend B1 on Azir, but at the end of the day, Vladi really wanted the champion, and he ended up making it work, so what can I say? And even Khalees, like the player I talked about the least, it's not like he played bad at all. He had a really, really good game. He just wasn't quite as influential in terms of the highlight plays as everybody else, but K-Corp looking incredibly strong. And then for Fnatic on the other side, they just kind of got outplayed. You can look in a couple directions for players that weren't quite as bad, kind of similar to how we talked about KOI in the previous series. Players like Upset, I think, looked good here. Oscar Renin wasn't, like, awful on the Gragas, although he had quite a bad, I would say, late game. Like, his team fights were not good at all. Razork, I think, was fine, generally speaking, on the Maokai, but Humanoid and Mickey X really stood out in a negative way for me for Fnatic. Humanoid just greeting and taking the Smolder. I've always hated the way that Humanoid drafts. I don't know if it's just Fnatic Fnatic. I don't know. It seems to happen no matter who the coach of Fnatic is, so it just leaves me to believe that this is Humanoid making a lot of these decisions, but he's just so greedy in terms of the champions that he wants to prioritize, and I think he got caught out once again here. I get that you want to match scaling for scaling. You want to be able to try and deal with Azir in the late game with a champion that might just be able to be stronger than him, but that has historically not been the way to answer Azir. The way to answer Azir is just to completely outroam him early on in games. And again, there were plenty of champions up at this point that were able to facilitate that idea, even if it's not Ahri, right? Like, there are other champions that can do that I think that there are plenty of other champions. How Sylas was available in this game, and I get that you drafted the Maokai, but it's not like Humanoid's bad at Sylas. Just anything that can be more proactive in the mid game, I think, would have been something that I preferred, but the Smolder ends up being a disaster, and Mickey X is going to get my dud of the game. Like I said earlier, Targamas is getting player of the game because he was awesome in terms of his engages, and he completely outroamed Mickey X. Mickey X is getting dud of the game because he wasn't even half as relevant throughout this entire game as Targamas was on the other side. Just a bad game, number one, from Fnatic. A lot of things they need to grow from, and they got to grow from them fast, because again, this series doesn't wait for you. If you go down 2-0, it's a really bad spot. Ask KOI in the previous series against Fnatic. So a big game number two here that Fnatic basically has to win, but if K-Corp can get that 2-0 lead, it's a pretty dominating position to be in. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number two was K-Corp. They are going to take game number two. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and things are looking dire for Fnatic. It doesn't just look bad, it looks horrendous. The fact that they ended up losing this game in the way that they did is absurd. Genuinely, there are players on this team that feel like they are not even trying, and the crazy part is I know that they are, because this is just who Fnatic is. This is who they have been for so many years. It is rolling the dice on whether or not you are going to get the best version of Razork and Humanoid, and I feel so bad for Fnatic fans, because year in and year out, you just have to hope and pray that in these big moments, Razork and Humanoid show up. And when they don't, when you have situations like this where they're given every opportunity to be able to come out and win this game for their team and they can't, it's gotta be heartbreaking. But for K-Corp, they're looking incredible moving on to game number three, up 2-0. You only gotta win one of the final three. That's a great place to be, and to do it as strongly as they did in this game is just magnificent. This is a great draft overall from K-Corp. I actually think I like this draft more, which is ironic because a very similar draft happened for Fnatic against KOI, and I think I was really complimentary of that, but this is a very different draft for K-Corp that they're going into. First of all, I think we saw why Humanoid wasn't exactly thrilled to play a lot of these roaming type of champions, because his Talia was not clean. Do not look at the scoreline. He got fed every bit of resource that Fnatic had in this game, and he did absolutely nothing with it. But even outside of that, like, you just couldn't compound it with Xin Zhao getting caught over and over and over again. If you're going to play a comp that needs control of the game, that is going to cede a lot of the scaling to Hui, to Sejuani frontline, to Mbessa, then you need to be able to win early. You need to be able to end this game out. If it's going 45 minutes, you have not accomplished your goal, and that is exactly what ended up happening for Fnatic, of course. K-Corp taking advantage of that. I think the Hui pick was great. I think an underratedly great pick here is the Ashe on R5. I know it feels very obvious, but Ashe shuts down Kalista. If the entire idea of this Fnatic draft is let's use the priority that Xin Zhao and Talia are going to generate in the middle of the map to make sure that Kalista has as easy of a time as possible, dominating early, then all of a sudden the Ashe on R5 just makes that unplayable. There is nothing to do in that instance because you completely take Kalista out of the game, and Kaliste is the one who did it. It's very funny to, talk about those two back to back, but the Ashe pick I think is going to go unsung for just how strong it was. But at the end of the day, Vladi was player of the game. Let's be direct here. This was an unbelievable Hui performance from him in the mid lane. He has really emerged. I know I've continued to have the same narrative about him, but I'm going to continue to have the same narrative about him. I get that he may not be the most flashy player in the world, but he certainly is the most consistent in the LEC. Outside of Caps, I don't know if there is a mid laner that I trust more than Vladi in the entirety of Europe. I think at this point, you just know game in and game out what you're going to get individually from him as a player. I'm not going to sit here and say that his highs are as high as Humanoid or Jojo Pune on their best days. I think their best games are still better than Vladi's best games, at least in my personal opinion. But his floor, his consistency is so much higher than those players, and you know what you're going to get so much more out of him than of those other guys, that he is more valuable. He is adding more wins to his individual team because he doesn't have the performances that Humanoid just showed off on the other side of this matchup. I am all in on Vladi being like the high floor, low ceiling superstar mid that the LEC has been looking for ever since Larson kind of fell off of Rogue. And so I think that he can fill that role. Obviously, he's not Larson. He's a very different player. He's probably better than what Larson is. But what everybody was talking about with Larson for so many years, this guy who you just kind of knew what you were going to get out of him. If you surrounded him with good pieces, he could be super valuable to a title-winning team. That's what Vladdy can be. He can be a #1 option any given game if he has to be, and he can also take a back seat. Just an incredibly valuable player. Kana continues to look incredible on the top side. He's been the best top laner in the LEC. There's been a lot of push for Oscar Rinnan recently, talking about how good he has been. As good as he has been, Kana has been better. He really has been that dominant over the beginning part of this year. Yike looked awesome on the Sejuani. Still love this champion. I get that people are getting tired of Sej. This champ just does everything you could want a jungler to do. Kaliste and Targamas were solid as well. Targamas may be a bit over-eager at times, but he's going into Mickey X. He's got to show that off at least a little bit, but fantastic game for K-Corp. They're sitting in a great spot at 2-0, about as good as you could possibly ask for. And quite frankly, they're just outplaying Fnatic, who is getting in their own way. It just doesn't feel like Fnatic has it today. It doesn't feel like they've had it in the entire playoffs, really. Even in that series against KOI, which did look good, like there were just things happening where I was like, you gotta clean this stuff up. And that's the problem with Fnatic, is they're not clean, they're not consistent, they don't have this, you know, like repeatable repertoire that they can go into game in and game out, and it's the middle of the map that let them down here. Dud of the game has to go to either Razork or Humanoid. I'm gonna give it to Razork in the jungle because, man, he was like actively inting on Xin Zhao at parts of this game, getting caught out in the middle of the jungle for absolutely no reason and dying without really any sort of purpose. You can't get away with that in the semifinals of the LEC. It's just not something that can happen, and with Razork being probably the best player in the regular season across the entire league, it's even more frustrating that he had such a bad playoff run, and that right now he's really dragging his team down in the semifinals. Humanoid's scoreline looks great, but that's because he was donated every resource that Fnatic had, and yet he still couldn't do anything with it in the late game. He ends up being an absolute nuisance for his own team because he's just not positioned correctly, and he gets caught out in bad spots. It's frustrating to watch Humanoid when he's not on his game. He is the streakiest player I have ever evaluated across any league. Like, on any he's like Pioshik levels of on any given day, and that's just got to be so frustrating out of the mid lane position. It's actually insane. Mickey X continues to just kind of be outplayed by his opposition on the other side. It's not been a good series from him. Upset's been good. Oscar Rinnan, I think, was fine on the top side. Not really much either of those two were going to be able to do to salvage this game, but Fnatic just don't look like they have it right now. Obviously, they have to come out and win game number 3 or else this series is over, but they gotta win game number 3 pretty handily because they gotta get their confidence back. And for K-Corp, you're one game away from punching your ticket to the finals to try and get your rematch against G2. Are you going to be able to do that in a 3-0 clean sweep, or is Fnatic going to be able to keep this series alive for at least one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series by winning game number 3 and their first game of the series, and boy did they need that. Boy, obviously would it have been bad if they went out in a clean sweep after taking care of KOI. It would have made the hierarchy very easy to determine going into the rest of the year, with the top 2 teams being very clear, and then Fnatic clearly in 3rd, KOI clearly in 4th. But no, we do have some fight in Fnatic. We'll see how long that fight ends up lasting for them, but at least for now, it definitely is still there. K-Corp with, yeah, a little bit of a cooked draft. It is definitely a very greedy one in terms of what they wanted to go for. I mean, every Zeri comp is like a Zeri comp, at least in the current day. Like, that's just how Zeri ends up operating as a champion. You want to play for her basically in any situation, but outside of the Zeri, there's not really that many pieces on this team that are there specifically to make her job a lot easier. The Zillion can do it, the Pantheon can do it, the Gnar can do it, even the Victor can be that secondary carry in terms of teamfight damage if you want to go for late 5v5s, but so much engage on the side of Fnatic, so many ways to get in. If you are going to play this like super dive comp on the side of Fnatic, and Zeri is going to be your primary target, then as K-Corp, you better be ready to try and deal with that. You better be ready to try and peel, and it just wasn't necessarily the case for them in this one. But once again, Fnatic doing a lot of really nice things. I think this was generally a very good game. I think it was a good draft with a really focused direction. I really love the Wukong pick. I think it really simplifies the process for someone like Razork, and it allows basically everybody on the map to just have a very straightforward, easy goal to end up shooting for, which is, let's play 5v5s. We can shoot for these. We can get teamfight engages. We're going to be in good spots. Like, we don't have to overthink overthink the problem. We can make it a little bit easier on ourselves, and that's exactly what they did. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game to me is going to go to Mickey X, although I think obviously Humanoid in terms of the scoreline and the damage he was able to output on that R5 Aurelion Sol. Upset was really good in this game on the Xayah as well. I think one of those two really should be getting, or one of those three, I should say, should be getting player of the game for me, but I'm going to give it to Mickey X. It felt like he was the most relevant player in the game. That Rakan was absolutely beautiful. It was his time to really step up when Fnatic needed him the most. Obviously, this is a player with a ridiculous amount of high leverage, high pressure experience. We talked about that for Kana and Yike over on Corp, how they are so comfortable and familiar playing in these big high pressure situations under the bright lights. I don't know if there's any player in the LEC outside of maybe Caps that's as familiar and experienced with that as Mickey X is in the support position, and he really stepped up when this team needed him the most. Targamas definitely was cooking on the other side with that Zilean support. Didn't exactly end up working out for Corp in the long run, but Mickey definitely was there to punish both the Zilean and the Zeri for overstepping in a lot of these fights, and the Pantheon to that extent. Hell, even the Gnar was not safe from the Rakan engages throughout this game. Just really great stuff coming in from Mickey. Upset and Humanoid were definitely the primary damage dealers throughout this one. Some really great team fights, specifically from Upset on the Xayah. His positioning in these team fights is just absolutely gorgeous. He knows how to keep himself safe in a lot of these instances without really putting too much pressure on himself, and then Humanoid, just a ridiculous amount of damage. The Aurelion Sol gets to the point where he just scales completely out of control. Again, I think the scoreline's a little misleading in terms of how relevant he was towards this game overall, but this was easily his best game of the series, and you do have to give him a ton of credit for that. Oscar and Razork were great too. Oscar's a really good Ornn player. This was the champion that he was the best at in his first split in the LEC when he was playing on Fnatic as a rookie and kind of really struggling to adapt. They kind of just put him on Ornn duty over and over again, and he got very comfortable on the champ, so I'm not surprised to see him pull it out when they really need a win here in game number 3. And like I said, the Wukong just simplifies the process, and Razork was definitely better than Yike in this game. We can say that really without any sort of exception. So nice game from Fnatic, but it's not really about winning game 3. It's about being able to keep that streak alive and move into games 4 and 5 potentially, and be able to, you know, keep that rolling. So we'll see with Fnatic, but for Corp, you just kind of got to dust this one off. You don't really want to think about it too much. Obviously, this draft is super greedy. Like I said, it is kind of a Zeri comp, if only because everything that drafts Zeri right now is kind of a Zeri comp. It just is the way that the champion ends up working out, but it's not exactly the most cohesive Zeri comp in the world. Yike ends up kind of running it on the Pantheon. So many situations where he just doesn't have the damage to actually be able to break through a lot of the things that he's going on top of in a lot of these fights. Kana is just breaking down on his own in the side lane for a majority of this game on the Gnar, not really accomplishing or doing all that much, and my dud of the game is going to go to Targamas on the Zilean. I think you could even consider giving this to Kaliste in the AD carry role, if only because Kaliste's team fighting was actually atrocious on the Zeri. I'm a big fan of Kaliste and what he's been offering in the LEC. That's not some sort of hot take or anything like that. I was a little bit late on the Kaliste train in comparison to a lot of other analysts, but man, he had some bad team fights here, but I think a lot of that was compounded by the fact that Targamas was so bad in this game on the Zilean. I'm done with him cooking. Put him back on Engagers. He's really good on those champions right now. He looks great on Leona. He looks great on Alistar. Those are the ones that have really been working out for him. Maybe not the Zilean all that much. You know, we'll see, obviously, what ends up going on later on into this series, but was not the biggest fan of that pick for him. And like I said, you know, Yike, Kana, even Kaliste, not playing great. Vladi was okay on the victory. Certainly not the one that I'm going to blame for this game, but Corp's got to be able to rebound. As we talked about for Fnatic in game number 3 last series, you don't want to go 2-2 after winning the first 2 games, because all of a sudden, all that momentum, all that excitement that you generated in the first 2 games, it just kind of washes away if you give them 2 free wins. Now, you're going into a do or die game number 5, and you've got a ton on the line. You have no momentum in the series, and you've got to be able to corral it back. This is a must-win for Corp and for Fnatic. If you can come out and win game number 4 after winning game number 3, it's going to feel like destiny to see another G2 Fnatic finals, and obviously, they're going to feel pretty confident coming out of that game number 4. So a big game here for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up this series at 2 apiece, and the reverse sweep is very much on the table for Fnatic here today. We are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. and Fnatic holds all the momentum and all of the cards in their hand. This is the most straightforward Fnatic-esque type of draft that you could possibly cook up for a game number 4. Basically, all of their comfort picks are on the table. The Vi is up, the Yone is up, the Kai'Sa is up, hell, even the Pyke for Mickey X is up. These are all some of the most comfortable champions for these individual players, and you know what? They took them and they ran with them. They got out to an early lead. They were able to maintain it the entirety of the game. They made no critical errors in the middle, which is not very Fnatic-esque, and brought us to this game number 5 that I'm very excited to get into. But what happened here with Corp? This should not have gone the way that it did, honestly. Like, in terms of how this game went, as much as I do like this draft for Fnatic in the idea that it's a lot of their comfort picks, it's a lot of the champions that these individual players are good at, and you should always lean into your playstyles rather than what's meta. I don't think Corp is, like, out of this game by any means. They honestly should control a lot of the early game. Basically, everything that isn't topside is pretty much free to, you know, deal with. Like, I even think Corki into Yone isn't really all that bad for Corki. I hate Corki mid lane, and I'm going to continue to die on that hill, but Caitlyn is an absolute nightmare for Kai'Sa. It's like the single worst Kai'Sa matchup in terms of the early game. It's not like Pyke really makes this better, especially with the Braum on the other side. Like, I don't love R5 Pyke in this game. I just don't think it adds the kind of pressure that maybe you would want it to. But if the bot lane's gonna lose anyways, if you're gonna put them in this good position and they're still gonna go down early on in the game, they're not gonna have any resources, and they are gonna make a lot of mistakes in the mid game, then it doesn't matter. Not, like, drafting Caitlyn doesn't matter, even if it is a good spot to draft something like Caitlyn. So definitely gotta be a bit frustrating for Corp. It felt like they had this entire series in the palm of their hand, and they are crushing it. They are throwing it away at the current moment, and that's a disaster. That would be worst case scenario, getting reverse swept by Fnatic out of the semifinals after you were so close to making your first ever LEC finals as an organization would feel absolutely heartbreaking, but it's not over yet. Still a lot to talk about, but let's get into game number 4. Player of the game for me is going to go to Razork in the jungle. He was definitely the player that was the most active across this entire map. He just was everywhere he needed to be. This really was a jungle gap, and it wasn't even entirely Yike's fault. Like, I don't think the Zyra really could do a ton to stop the Vi in this particular instance, but this is the kind of champion that Razork is just so unbelievably comfortable on. This is the kind of champion that got him, like, MVP frontrunner votes if there was one in the winter split. This is the reason that we're talking about Razork in the quality that we are, because when he's on a champion that has such a straightforward mid-game power spike that can really execute both early on in the game because of the combat 3v3 power, and also just the straightforward ultimate in the back half of the game that allows you to get on a priority target and really disrupt a lot of things. Like, that's Razork. He doesn't need to overcomplicate the situations. He's really good at League of Legends. If you just kind of simplify everything down for him, he can really perform at a very high level, and that's what Vi individually as a champion ends up doing. It's why he's always been very good at champions like Ivern as well. When he has a clear directive, a clear thing that he's supposed to be doing at any given time, he does that thing really well. It's usually just when you ask him to do a bunch of things for the team that he can get a little bit over, I guess, analytical in terms of his approach, and can sometimes just try to do everything and not be able to accomplish that in the same kind of way. But this was a great Vi game in game number 4. We were asking for Razork to wake up, and that's exactly what he did in the most important game so far. I think Humanoid and Upset were obviously also ginormous. They also got comfort picks. Humanoid less so on the Yone. Like, I like the Yone, and it fits into what Fnatic really likes doing individually as a team because this dive comp is really strong, but I wouldn't say that it's his best champion or anything. I think it just fits the narrative, and again, you're going into Corki mid, so almost anything is going to have more prio than that champion on the other side, but I think Yone actually isn't in a great spot to be able to duel him 1v1 if the lane is going to be isolated, or if they're going to fight 2v2 alongside the Zyra. I don't think it's like a perfect situation, but, you know, Humanoid, I think, definitely made it work. Upset really outplayed his circumstance in this game. This should not have been an easy game for the Kai'Sa. This is not a game that you're looking at and going, well, Kai'Sa should do really well and should walk out with 11 kills and 8 assists and only 2 deaths. Like, that's not the situation that should have happened with Kai'Sa in this one, but Upset was just so good that he ended up creating that. He has genuinely been phenomenal for Fnatic. Basically no notes for him as an AD carry. Everything you could ask for out of the position he is showing right now. Oscar continues to be an absolute rock on the top side. This was a great Scion game, and I think it's going to go a bit undervalued because the scoreline isn't as flashy. Mickey was definitely the least valuable player on the team here on the Pyke, but whatever, man. Like, this isn't the best Pyke game in the universe. He was there. He was along for the ride. He was he was helping out. He had a couple of really nice ultimates on the Pyke, a couple of nice resets, but for the most part, it was Razork, it was Upset, and it was Oscarinin that I think really stood out to me in a positive way for Fnatic to keep them alive and push them to that game 5. But for K-Corp on the other side, you gotta get it together. This bot lane was just not good enough, and quite frankly, through the last 2 games, they've not been good enough. Kalist and Targamas have definitely looked outclassed by Upset and Mickey X through the second half of this series, which is frustrating because the first 2 games were really solid for them. I think that there were definitely a lot of things to take away in a positive light there, but Kalist has not really been that good of a team fighter in the last 2 games. Not that he really had an opportunity in this one, but the Zeri game really disappointed me, and Targamas for the second game in a row is going to get my dud of the game in a very pivotal moment. It's a bad time for them to be playing some of the weaker games they played all split. They have to be able to get it together. If this team is going to be able to get to the finals, it's likely going to be off the back of this bot lane, having a recovery time period, being able to, figure things out and coming out in game 5 and actually keeping up with Upset and Mickey on the other side of this. I think Vladi also had easily his worst game of the series. Can we please just abandon Corki mid? Like, maybe not like fully. Like, there are matchups where I think it's playable, and honestly, this might even be one of them, but golly, this champion just takes away a lot of the agency that your team generally has, and it's so important that you have agency in the middle of the map right now. I'm really just not a fan of Corki in the mid lane. I think he's so strong in the bot lane if you're going to put him down there, because I think he actually can be a bit of a threat in the 2v2, considering, like, depending on what the support is and considering what the meta is. There are a lot of meta AD carries that he just beats early on and can actually really outscale very effortlessly, and he's going to be useful in team fights, but if you're asking him to skirmish all the time in the 3v3s like a mid laner basically has to do in this meta, he just can't really accomplish that to the same level as a lot of the other mids, and it really holds his own teams back. It's why his win rate was absolutely diabolically bad in the East for so long this year. He was like 0-17 in the LCK before he finally picked up a win. It's because this guy just has no agency in the middle of the map, and it's frustrating to see teams continue to value him. I get that it's Fearless Draft and options are getting limited, but there are other options, and put him in the bot lane if nothing else. This is a good game for Corki bot if you wanted to play that. So I continue to be frustrated. Kana and Yike are not the problem. Even if Yike was out jungled by Razork in this game, they need to be able to play better, but it's not up to them. It's going to be up to Kalist and Targamas. I really do believe that if this bot lane can survive, I think K-Corp can absolutely win this game number 5, but they have to do so, and they have to do it now because it's do or die. It is winner take all in the semifinals, the lower bracket finals here. The winner of this game will be moving on to face G2 in the finals. The loser will be done for the winter split. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to survive the reverse sweep. It will not be completed. They're going to win this series 3-2, and they will get their rematch with G2 in the Winter Split Finals for a chance to go represent the LEC at the First Stand tournament. They're going to be underdogs going into that series. We'll talk about that at the end of the video, but wow, this is an incredible comeback, I guess, from them. It looked like it was going to be an insane comeback from Fnatic, going down 0-2 and being able to bring it back to a game number 5, but they're just not able to close it out. I think Fearless definitely came back to bite both of these teams in this draft, and we're going to talk about it. It's not in the ways that I personally see a lot of people talking about it. There are a couple of picks in this game that I think are totally justifiable for Fnatic that people are really ridiculing on, and a couple of picks that I think are bad that really don't work at all for Fnatic's win condition that I don't think people are ragging on enough. But we gotta talk about K-Corp first, or at least we gotta talk about their draft first. What I think they did really well was abuse red side, and quite frankly, that was something that happened throughout the entirety of this series. We saw that evolution going from games 2 through 5. Red side won all of those games. The only blue side victory was game number 1 of this series, and that's not something that we're seeing all that regularly in a lot of other regions or a lot of other series. Blue side has definitely still been dominant this year. It's definitely still been the better side to win on, especially over in the eastern region. So especially to see these teams start selecting red side in a lot of these games, it definitely was a big swing in momentum. We saw Fnatic select red side for game number 3 and win on it. We saw K-Corp select red side for game number 5 and win on it, and that's obviously very interesting, but I think K-Corp did a great job of abusing that red side, getting that counter pick, and making sure they're in a good spot to be able to win in an important part of the map and to be able to push their tempo as much as possible. I'm talking, of course, about the R5 Renekton, which I think actually was really gigantic here. The Camille is not in a good spot to be able to play this game. Camille into Renekton is not a good matchup for Camille. She's not really going to be able to establish pressure early. She can't really scale the game out all that easily. Like, it's just not a good matchup for Camille, and, we'll talk about it. I guess we'll just just get to it now. Everybody's ragging on the Volibear pick coming out B2 for Fnatic. I think Volibear's totally fine in this draft. I actually kind of like Volibear in particular into what K-Corp had at the time, which was Jarvan and Aurora. I think that Volibear can actually be really useful in that matchup, specifically against Aurora. I actually really like Volley as an answer to that champion, but it was everything else that I think you compounded on top of it. Obviously, the Camille I'm not a fan of, mostly because it got countered, and I think it's too aggressive for the draft that you ended up drafting, but Misfortune Lulu, I think, is rightfully getting criticized quite a bit. I think MF can work in certain circumstances, not with Lulu. This is not a duo that can exist in pro play right now. Lulu is exclusively for hyper carries down in the bot lane, champions that you want to give all of the resources so that she can really kind of, they can dominate the games. Like, Lulu's entirely just an extension of her AD carry, and Misfortune needs setup in order to be useful because she is literally an R button throughout a majority of this game. And so I really don't like this duo. I think that was the big mistake for Fnatic, was drafting Lulu and then into Misfortune. I think the Volibear is actually fine. I really don't have any major criticisms with the champion. I have a lot of criticisms with the way that Razork ended up playing the champion in this game, but I don't have an issue with Volley individually in this game. I just have an issue with the bot lane duo that I think is super anti-synergistic and really did end up costing Fnatic in this final game. But come on, it's K-Corp. We got to talk about them first. Player of the game and player of the series is very easily, to me, going to go to Vladi in the mid lane. I think this is his best series ever. I know he's had some really good best of fives. He had a couple of really good ones last year at the end of 2024 when he came in for K-Corp, when this team did finish top 3 in the spot that Fnatic is finishing in right now. But I really do believe that he has never played a series quite like he played this one. Games 2 and 5 in particular were absolutely sensational, and it just goes back to show you, like, maybe the ceiling I'm projecting too low. Like, this guy is top 2 in his role in the region right now. He is better than Humanoid. He is better than Jojo Pune, and I think he has, like, really asserted that. I don't even think there's really all that much of a conversation to be had around that fact at this point. He's just awesome on every type of champion you could want. He's a great control mage player. He can play things like Aurora and side lane. He can be more aggressive on assassins. Like, it's just whatever. Like, you want him to roam on Talia, he can do that really well too. It does not matter. He is just so versatile, so strong out of the middle of the map, and I just don't think that there are a lot of mid laners in the league right now that can actually keep up with his pace. The fact that he's 19 years old and is only getting better has shown, like, incredible growth coming from his time, you know, just a couple of years ago in the NLC now to, you know, being in the LEC and actively being able to dominate. It's just awesome stuff for Vladi, and I'm really proud of him. I'm really proud of the development. We talked about how Kalist and Targamas needed to be the better bot lane duo. They absolutely were. I think the funny thing is that if K-Corp lost this game, the entire community would turn on Jhin and Karma instead of turning on Misfortune and Lulu. It was literally just results-oriented, who they ended up criticizing. I like Jhin. I think Jhin is a very good pick. I've talked about that a ton on the channel. I think Jhin Karma is very difficult to deal with. I think it's one of the scarier lanes you could get at, like, a game 5 of a Fearless draft when so many things are off the board. So many of those counters are not available to you anymore, but I think these two obviously piloted it really well. Yike and Kana were also really good. I think Kana had a really good series. Yike was okay, was pretty solid, was not necessarily on his best here today, but was still good enough. But at the end of the day, Vladi was the best player on K-Corp. I think Targamas was really good specifically in their wins, but was not so good in their losses. And Kana just continues to be so consistent as a top laner, being able to survive or win in so many situations. The Renekton was crucial towards the success of K-Corp in this game, and he's not going to get enough credit for that. So overall, awesome series for K-Corp. They looked really excellent. And for Fnatic, it's just worst case scenario. This team very much expected to get themselves into the finals. It is a shock to the system for them. I think that they are going to be missing it, that they are going to be going out in third place here, but I can't say it's a shock to me. I kind of expected this going into this series. K-Corp had been better for a majority of the playoffs, and I do believe they project better going forward into the future in terms of their players individually. And once again, it's just them getting outplayed. It's Fnatic not really having any ways to stay in this one. Razork is going to get dud of the game for game number 5. People are criticizing the Volibear pick. I think you need to separate the gameplay from the champion. This is a very playable Volibear game, and this was a horrible Razork performance. And I think both of those things can very much exist in the world here. Razork was just atrocious, just awful at being able to do the thing he's supposed to do this game, which is shut down the Aurora. Like, that's the entire idea behind drafting Volibear on B2, is saying, you've got Jarvan Aurora, you clearly want to enable the middle of the map. Well, I'm going to draft Volibear and I'm going to shut her down, and I'm going to force you to win through Renekton or Jhin, which is going to be much more difficult for you. And he didn't even do that. It was actually so frustrating. Just not a very good game from Razork. Oscar was not good at all here in game number 5, although I'm going to give him a pass because he was so good throughout every other game of this series and basically every other game of the entire split, even the losses. Like, he was really good in a lot of games, so The fact that he wasn't good in Game 5, it is what it is. Humanoid got completely outplayed by Vladi in this series. I think at this point we can comfortably say that Humanoid is not a top 2 mid laner in the LEC, and, you know, I was saying that long before, but I'm glad to see that everybody's kind of caught on to that. Upset and Mickey X, just, you know, misfortune Lulu. Like, what are you gonna do? Upset's awesome. I still feel very good about Upset, and Mickey X is a very good player who had a very good split, but this is an unfortunate way for it to end. Fnatic's split is done. They're gonna be going out in 3rd place. They've obviously got a lot that they need to come back and fix. They couldn't quite get the reverse sweep in order, but I still think that there is a lot in the tank for this team, and right now they're still on pace to be Worlds caliber, but K-Corp was simply just better today, and they're walking out of this series with the win to prove it. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Semifinals Winter Split overview and analysis video. Only one series remains, G2 Esports taking on K-Corp. The winner, of course, representing the LEC at first stand, and your LEC Winter Split champions. They are going to have a banner in the rafters forever. It's a big finals. It's K-Corp's first ever LEC finals. G2 has the chance to go back to back to back to back to back to back, I believe it is. I think that's 6 in a row for them, and I think it would be 7 of the last 8. 8 in the new format. I'm sure somebody can correct me down there, but I think the only one that they have not won in the current format was Spring 2023. I think they won Winter 2023, Summer 2023, Season Finals 2023. They won all 4 splits in 2024. And if they win here, yeah, that would be 7 of the last 8. So, you know, they're on a bit of a roll. 8 of the last 9, something like that. Like, you guys will let me know down in the... I think it would be 8 of the last 9, something like that. Let me know down in the comment section below what it is, but it would be absolutely ludicrous. I mean, they are already dominating Europe at an unprecedented rate. It's the most dominant performance we have ever seen from any major region ever. There has never been a team to do what G2 has been doing the past couple of years, and now they've got to do it against their former jungler in Yike, who helped them get so many of those championships, and I, for one, am very excited to see how it ends up going. I'm gonna predict G2 in this series. It's basically impossible not to. In fact, I'm gonna go with a very similar series to what ended up happening in Winners Finals. I think that G2 probably drops game number 1. K-Corp comes out and looks really good in that first game, and then G2 just fires back. It's a 3-1 series win. They win games 2, 3, and 4. They walk out as champions. They go to first stand, and they do pretty well at that tournament. That's gonna be the anticipation. That's the expectation, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comment section below. Always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the LEC finals, but the LPL finals are gonna be covered on this channel tomorrow. We're also gonna be streaming once again tomorrow some Citadel games at around 6 or 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's gonna be somewhere around 3 or 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time if you are watching there. We'll be live here both on YouTube and on Twitch. The link to that is in the description if you are interested. Come check it out. Come say hi. But we're also going to be posting a ton of first stand content when that tournament ends up coming around. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all